The first thing Dara noticed about the alien ship was how much the crew talked. They talked while they worked. They talked while they ate. They talked in the corridors outside her cell at all hours, their voices rising and falling in a language that sounded like water running over smooth stone, musical, layered, and completely ignored by the small human child sitting, cross-legged, on the floor of her observation chamber, staring at her own hands. That was what they saw, a child staring at her hands. They were wrong about almost everything else, but they were right about one thing. She was small. Dara was 9 years old, with red hair that had grown past her shoulders in the months since the colony ship ISV Marigold had been disabled and boarded. She had her mother's sharp eyes and her father's habit of going very still when something important was happening. She had been very still for a long time now. The alien they called Goss was the one who brought her food. He was a junior technician, shorter than the others, with a pale blue tint to his skin and 4 fingers on each hand. He was not cruel. He was something harder to deal with than cruel. He was indifferent, in the way a person is indifferent to a dog they pass on the street, noting it exists, feeling nothing particular about it. He slid her food through the tray slot and spoke to his colleague without looking at her. "No change in the specimen," he said, in his own language. "Sits in the same position for hours, eats when food is provided, shows no stress behaviors." His colleague, barely visible in the corridor, made a sound of agreement. "Brawl says the brain scans are within normal range for the species, no indicators of higher language processing." "Expected," Goss said. "They are pre-contact, barely post-tribal." He left without a backward glance. Dara waited until his footsteps faded. Then she picked up the piece of soft gray material she used as a blanket, turned it over in her hands, and quietly repeated the phrase she had just heard, not out loud, in her head, matching each sound to the shape she had given it weeks ago. "No change in the specimen." She filed it under the section she privately called "Things They Believe That Are False." That section was getting very long. Her mother had been a linguist, not a famous one, not someone who wrote books. She was the kind of linguist who worked colony intake desks, helping settlers from 12 different Earth nations communicate during the first terrible months on a new world. She used to play games with Dara on long transit nights. Sound games, pattern games. She would say a word in a language Dara did not know, and Dara would repeat it back until the shape of it sat right in her mouth. Then her mother would say the next word. It was not a survival skill her mother had intended to teach her. It turned out to be the only one that mattered. Vethric, what Dara privately called the alien language, had 41 distinct phonemes, a tonal system based on breath pressure rather than pitch, and a grammatical structure built around the subject's relationship to certainty. Everything a Vethric speaker said was slightly different depending on how sure they were of it. It was, her mother would have said, a language built by people who were afraid of being wrong. Dara had started breaking it apart in the second week. By the end of the first month, she understood roughly 1 word in 4. By the end of the third month, she understood almost everything. She had told no one. There was a reason for that. Several reasons, actually, all of them filed neatly in the section she called "Things I Know That They Do Not Know I Know." The most important reason was this: the moment they discovered she understood them, they would stop talking freely. And the talking was the most valuable thing happening on this ship. The observation cell had a transparent wall that faced the main corridor. From where Dara sat, she could see a portion of the research bay to the left and the communications station to the right. It was, she had concluded, a very stupid place to put a prisoner you wanted to keep ignorant, but they had not built that wall to keep her from hearing. They had built it so they could watch her. They watched her stare at her hands. They watched her draw pictures on the soft floor with her fingertip, idle scratches, they thought, the way an animal paces. They were not idle scratches. In the dust along the base of the left wall, she had mapped the ship's corridor system as best she could determine it from foot traffic patterns. In the corner near the food slot, she had written, in her own private shorthand, the words she had heard most frequently near the door controls. She had overheard the docking sequence 3 days ago when Goss recited his maintenance checklist while standing 2 meters from her cell. He had not looked at her once. Now Overseer Brawl's voice came through the corridor, dictating his daily log into a small recorder. Specimen continues passive observation phase, no threat indicators, no communication attempts, recommend continued standard observation, no adjustment to containment protocol required. Dara listened, she breathed slowly, she did not look up. When his footsteps passed, she used one fingernail to scratch a small new mark into the floor beside the others. It was the Vethric word for door mechanism. She had been saving it for when she was sure of the spelling. She was sure now. She pressed her back against the wall, pulled her blanket over her legs, and looked at her hands the way they expected her to look at her hands. Somewhere deeper in the ship, separated from her by sealed doors and 3 months of silence, Dr. Willa Osai was still alive. Dara knew this because she had heard it confirmed 6 days ago in a conversation between Goss and the navigator. Dr. Osai was the reason Dara had decided to be patient. She was also the reason that patience was running out. There is a certain kind of quiet that is not empty. Dara lived in that kind of quiet. It had weight. It had texture. She had filled it so completely over the past months that sometimes it felt less like silence and more like a very full room that simply had no sound in it. 2 days after she mapped the door mechanism word, Goss brought her something new. He held it up outside the transparent wall before he slid it through the slot, the way a person holds up food for an animal to inspect before placing it in the bowl. It was a drawing pad, small, square, made for alien hatchlings. The pages were slightly too large for her hands, and the texture was closer to cloth than paper, but it was flat, and it was white, and that was all she needed. Stimulation object, Goss said to his recorder as he slid it through. Standard issue for non-verbal specimens displaying low environmental engagement. May reduce stress indicators. Dara picked it up. She turned it over in her hands the way she had seen young children on the colony touch new things, slowly, with exaggerated curiosity, mouth slightly open. Goss watched for approximately 4 seconds, noted something on his recorder, and walked away satisfied. She waited a full hour before she began to write. Not in any language they would recognize. Over the course of months, she had developed her own shorthand, a private system of symbols that looked, to any observer, like the random mark-making of a bored child, loops and lines and small stacked shapes. She had practiced making them look casual even when she was working quickly. She opened to the first page and began to transcribe from memory. Her mother had taught her the memory palace technique when she was 6. Every sound gets a shape, her mother had said, sketching little pictures in the margin of a transit schedule. Give it a house, give it a street, then you can always find your way back. Dara's memory palace was a version of the colony settlement she had grown up in: long flat avenues, low buildings, a central square. She had been storing information in it for months. Each street held a category. The avenue along the east side held crew rotations and shift schedules, overheard across dozens of routine conversations. The square in the center held the most critical material, the emergency overhead phrase for the ship's containment systems, spoken aloud by Don, the communications officer, during a frustrated rant about a minor system malfunction. The building at the far end of the northern street held the access code for the research bay door, which Brawl had read aloud to himself while standing in the corridor because the panel was at an angle he found awkward. People, Dara had learned, talked to themselves constantly when they thought no one was listening. She filled 12 pages before she stopped. From the outside, the drawings looked like shapes and patterns, the kind of thing any child would fill a pad with when given no other entertainment. From the inside, they were 47 indexed data points covering 6 months of intelligence collection. She hid nothing, she simply made it look like nothing. That afternoon, Navigator Suvra passed her cell twice. On the second pass, Suvra stopped. She stood at the transparent wall and looked at Dara with an expression Dara had learned to read as professional curiosity, not warmth, but interest. The same expression a researcher wears when a data point does something slightly unexpected. Dara stared back. She made her face very smooth. Savra said, almost to herself, remarkable adaptation to captivity, no visible distress after 6 months. She tilted her head. Either it has very low cognitive engagement with its environment, or... She trailed off, let the thought go, made a note on her tablet and moved on. Dara let out a breath she had been holding for 10 seconds. The word or was the most dangerous word in any language. She turned to a fresh page and drew a careful series of shapes. She was documenting the conversation with Savra before she lost the exact phrasing. Exact phrasing mattered. There was a difference in Vethric's certainty-based grammar between she may not understand and she cannot understand. The gap between those two phrases was enormous. Savra had used the first one. That evening, Braal's voice drifted in from the research bay during what was apparently a briefing for 2 junior staff she hadn't seen before. His tone was the flat, professional kind he used when performing for an audience. The specimen represents a baseline sample of uncontacted human development. We assess no communication risk. No protocol modifications are necessary. She is, in every observable metric, simply a frightened child. One of the junior staff asked a follow-up question Dara couldn't quite catch. Braal answered clearly, "No, there is nothing to be afraid of." Dara looked down at the drawing pad in her lap. She counted her pages, 12 completed, 43 blank. She thought about Dr. Osai, somewhere behind those sealed doors, refusing to cooperate with their experiments. She thought about the conversation she had overheard 4 days ago, just a fragment, just Braal saying the phrase, "remove the incentive," in the clipped, administrative tone he used for things that had already been decided. She turned to page 13. She began to write faster. The drawing pad had been a gift. That was how Goss saw it. He had given an animal a toy to occupy itself. Dragons, Dara thought, do not play with toys. They collect what they need, they wait, and when the moment is right, they do not roar. They simply open their eyes. And everything changes. Patience is not the same as doing nothing. Dara had been patient for 6 months. She had sat still, listened well, and kept her face empty while her mind filled to the edges. But Braal's phrase, "remove the incentive," had been rattling around inside her chest for 4 days now, and she had run the options 36 times and arrived at the same conclusion every time. She needed to act, carefully, quietly, and through the only person on this ship who had ever looked at her like she might be something more than data. Goss arrived for the morning feeding at the same time he always did. Dara was already sitting near the food slot, drawing pad in her lap. She had been up since the ship's lighting shifted from its night cycle dimness to its working day level, preparing what she needed. On the top page of the drawing pad, she had drawn what appeared to be a simple picture. A circle, some lines, a small figure in the middle. Alien children's art, completely meaningless. Underneath the picture, in the lower right corner, she had written 19 small symbols in her private shorthand, the kind of marks she had been making in this pad for weeks. Except these ones were not in her shorthand. These ones were in Vethric, written very small, written to look, at a quick glance, like more of the same decorative child markings. She had spent 2 hours getting the grammar right. When Goss slid the food tray through, Dara picked it up, set it to one side, and then held out the drawing pad to him through the slot. She used the motion she had observed very young children use when offering a gift, both hands extended, eyes slightly downcast, non-threatening, simple, the gesture of a creature too limited to have an agenda. Goss took the pad. He turned it over the way he always did with objects she produced, scanning it professionally. He looked at the front page, drawing for about 3 seconds. His gaze passed over the symbols in the corner. He registered them as more decorative marks. He was about to hand it back. Then he paused. Something had snagged, not understanding, just a small hesitation, the mental equivalent of a foot catching on uneven ground. Dara watched his eyes go back to the corner of the page. He looked at the symbols for a long moment. He did not know her private shorthand, but these were not in her shorthand. These were in his language, and some part of his brain was recognizing the shapes even while the rest of his mind rejected the implication entirely. He read them. Then he read them again. The message said, in simple formal Vethric, "The other human is in the lower corridor. I know which door. Tell her, be ready." Goss stood very still. Dara could see the exact moment the meaning landed, a slight widening of his eyes, a change in the set of his shoulders. He looked up from the pad and met her eyes. She looked back. She made her face do nothing. He looked back down at the page, then around the corridor, then at the pad again, as if it might have changed, as if rereading it would reveal some other interpretation. It would not. Dara's Vethric grammar was, by now, better than his. Goss put the pad under his arm, said nothing, and left. That evening, Dara staged her next move. She had been observing the ship's ventilation diagnostic system for 6 weeks. The maintenance cycle ran through the corridor sections in a predictable order, and the reset codes were entered verbally by the officer on rotation. She had collected 3 of them. What she needed to know was not the code itself. She needed to know which crew members went where when a diagnostic alert triggered. She needed the map of their emergency response. She used her food container. The base of it was flat and slightly hollow, and if struck in a specific pattern against the floor, it produced a low resonant tone that traveled through the ship's internal structure. She had tested this carefully over 6 sessions, always stopping before it became noticeable. Tonight she tapped out a rhythm, 17 beats, in a specific grouping. The ventilation system registered an anomaly in corridor section 4. The alert was minor. It triggered automatically, lit up 2 panels, and sent a low pulse through Don's station at the communications desk. Dara watched through the transparent wall as 3 crew members moved, Goss toward the secondary junction, a junior technician toward the environmental panel, and Don straight to the reset terminal. Don was irritated. She could tell by the speed of his walk and the angle of his shoulders. He reached the terminal, entered his access credentials, and spoke the reset phrase aloud to confirm the voice lock. Dara filed it. Don turned around on his way back and looked at her cell, the way people look at the nearest thing when they are annoyed and need something to blame. Probably a seal in the specimen chamber again, he said to no one. He walked away, muttering. 40 minutes later, Goss reappeared at her cell. He stood outside the transparent wall in the dimming night cycle light and simply looked at her. His expression was very difficult to read. It was not the flat indifference he usually wore. It was something more complicated, and Dara recognized it because she had seen it before on the colony, on the face of adults who had just understood something they could not undo. He did not speak. He did not need to. He had delivered the message. Dara gave him a small nod, so small it could have been dismissed as a head adjustment. Then she lay down on her side and faced the wall. She heard him stand there for a moment longer, then she heard him leave. She closed her eyes and ran the corridor map again in her head. 3 routes, 2 door codes confirmed, 1 override phrase freshly collected. The first move was done. Now she waited to see what Dr. Osai would do with it. The ship ran quieter at night. Not completely quiet. The engines were always there, a low hum in the walls, and the ventilation ticked through its cycles. And somewhere below the corridor, there was always the soft sound of equipment running data loops that never stopped. But the crew thinned out. Voices went away. The corridor outside Dara's cell went from busy to empty in the space of an hour, and the lights shifted from the bright, flat working white to a softer blue that the aliens seemed to find restful. Dara found it useful. She was lying on her side, facing the transparent wall, eyes mostly closed, close enough to sleep that any camera feed would log her as resting. She had learned, over months, how to be technically awake while appearing completely elsewhere. It was a skill she suspected most children were never required to develop. She heard them before she saw them. Commander Vane's voice, entering the research bay from the far side, accompanied by the heavier step Dara had long since identified as Navigator Suvra. Their footsteps stopped just past the bay's interior door, out of sight from the corridor, but not out of range of Dara's cell, which shared a partial wall with the bay. They believed she was asleep. They believed she understood nothing, so they did not check. They did not lower their voices. They spoke the way people speak in empty rooms. "The route adjustment has been submitted," Suvra said. "We reached the holding station in 19 days at current speed." "And the specimens?" Vane's voice was crisp. She was a precise speaker, every word landing exactly where she intended. "The adult continues to be uncooperative. Brawl recommends moving to the next phase without her input." Agreed, her cooperation was preferable, not necessary. A pause, the soft sound of a tablet being set on a surface, and the child. "No changes. Brawl is satisfied she presents no complications." Vane made a sound of mild agreement. Then she said something that made Dara's chest go very still. "Good, because the collective's position cannot be exposed at this stage. If the human expansion is allowed to continue at its current pace, they will reach deep space within 2 generations. The Assembly has decided this is not acceptable. The quarantine designation was approved at the last full session, uncontacted, pre-diplomatic, containment priority." Suvra responded carefully, "And the ships they will send looking for the colony vessel will find debris. The cover story is prepared." Vane picked up her tablet. Her voice stayed perfectly level, the way a level voice sounds when it is being held that way deliberately. "These two are not research specimens, Suvra. They are the first proof of concept. The holding station will house whatever assets we gather from the colony before the quarantine hardens. After that, humanity will not have the reach to ask questions." A silence, then Suvra very quietly, "And if they are smarter than we have assessed?" Vane said, "They are not. We have been watching them for 30 years. They are loud and fast and completely unaware of how small they are. The child is 9 years old and has shown no sign of distress cognition since her capture. The adult cannot even cooperate with basic research queries." Her footsteps moved toward the far door. "They are not a threat. They are a problem with a known solution." Dara heard the door open, heard them leave, heard the room settle back into silence. She did not move for a long time. She lay on her side in the blue-lit dark and let the words finish arriving, all of them, every syllable, the full weight of it coming in the way cold water comes in after a hull breach. First the surface, and then all at once. 30 years of watching, the quarantine designation, the debris story, the holding station, the colony. Not research, never research. She breathed in, breathed out. She counted the breath the way her mother had taught her: 4 in, hold 4, 4 out, until the shaking in her hands stopped. Then she sat up and reached for the drawing pad. She worked in the dark. She did not need much light anymore. She knew the symbols by feel. She wrote for a long time, going back through every stored conversation, pulling the threads together in order. Dates, she had been tracking them on a private count. Names and ranks, the route, the override phrase, the holding station reference. The exact wording of the quarantine discussion, preserved in her memory with the accuracy of someone who had trained for 6 years to hear and hold sounds. When she finished, she counted the pages she had used. 47. She stared at them. Then she looked at the food tray slot, and at the collection cycle she had mapped over months: waste trays, logged as biological discard, collected and data tagged, and transmitted in compressed packets to the collective's relay station on the 3rd day of each ship week. She knew this because Don had complained about the packet size during a frequency calibration check, within earshot of her cell 6 weeks ago. She also knew because Goss had read his own assignment orders aloud in the corridor, mispronouncing the contractor designation twice before getting it right, that the relay station on this route had a human monitoring contract. Commercial, bandwidth leasing, a small company out of the outer colonies that handled signal traffic for half a dozen deep space routes. It was a thin thread, the thinnest possible thread. But Dara had learned, in 9 years and 6 months of captivity and a childhood spent on a colony where resources were always short, that thin threads were still threads. She tore the 47 pages carefully from the pad. She folded them into the smallest possible square. On the outside fold, in plain printed letters, not in her shorthand, not in Vethric, in English, she wrote, "My name is Dara. I am 9 years old. I have been list and ing4months. Please find US." She placed it at the bottom of her food tray and covered it with the remains of her meal. Then she set the tray in the slot and sat back. The collection cycle ran in 11 hours. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, in the blue-lit dark, with the patience of someone who had already been waiting for 6 months and knew, better than anyone, exactly how to make it through 11 more hours of silence. 3 days after the tray went out, Brawl announced the new schedule. Dara heard it through the research bay wall, delivered in his flat administrative tone to a small cluster of junior staff. Dr. Osai's cooperation phase was being closed. The next phase, invasive biological sampling, would begin the following morning. He used the clinical language that all people use when they want a thing to sound like it is not what it is. Dara heard it and sat very still while she did the arithmetic. The relay station was far. She had estimated transmission lag at somewhere between 30 and 60 hours, depending on the station's current orbit position. Then there was the question of whether the right person would read the packet at all, and whether they would understand what they were looking at, and whether they would have the authority or the means to act. The thread was still very thin. She knew that. She also knew that the morning was 11 hours away. There was only one move left, and she had known for weeks it was there. She had avoided it because using it meant giving up the thing that had kept her safe, the assumption. Once she spoke, they would review everything, every log, every camera file, every conversation held within range of her cell. The wall she had hidden behind for 6 months would come down. But the wall had always been a temporary structure. She had built it to buy time, not to live in. The morning shift began. Brawl arrived early, which he did when he was preparing something he considered significant. He moved through the research bay with the brisk energy of a person who had already made all his decisions and was simply executing them now. He did not look at Dara's cell as he passed. 2 junior staff took up positions at equipment stations along the far wall. Goss, arriving slightly late, moved to his usual post and pulled up his morning checklist. He glanced once at Dara's cell. His face was careful and unreadable. Brawl picked up his recorder and began dictating his morning log. Dara stood up. She walked to the transparent wall. She had never done this, never positioned herself at the wall deliberately, never in any way that might indicate directed purpose. She had always moved casually, randomly, the way the animals move in the nature archives she had watched as a small child. She placed both hands flat against the transparent surface. Brawl was still dictating. His back was half-turned. Dara said, in a clear and level voice, in Vethric, "Overseer Brawl." It was not loud. She did not need it to be loud. The research bay had very good acoustics. She had confirmed this over months of listening. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that came after them was total. Brawl stopped mid-word. She waited 2 seconds, then she continued. She used the formal mode of address. She used his full title. She used the honorific reserved for senior research staff addressing a superior in an official capacity. Every syllable was correct. Her tones were correct. Her breath pressure was correct. "I wish to register a formal report of procedural violation under Section 14 of the Collective Research Conduct Charter," she said. "Specifically, the unauthorized disclosure of classified collective policy directives within an unsecured observation zone, in the presence of an uncleared specimen, by Commander Vane and Navigator Suvra, occurring during the ship's last third-cycle night period." She paused. Nobody in the research bay had moved. Goss had gone the color of something that had lost all its blood. "Under Section 14, Clause 3, Dara continued, a documented witness to a policy disclosure has the right to provide recorded testimony before any irreversible biological or physical action is taken against that witness aboard the vessel. I am formally invoking that right." She stopped speaking. The silence in the research bay was a different quality of silence than the one she had been living in for 6 months. That silence had been empty. This one was full of something very large that had nowhere to go. Brawl turned around very slowly. He looked at her. His eyes did the thing that Dara had only seen twice before, a rapid adjustment, the visual equivalent of a system rebooting, when the thing in front of you is not what the system was designed to process. She looked back at him. She kept her hands flat on the wall. She kept her face very calm, the way she had practiced in the dark for months when she knew this moment was coming and made herself ready for it. "Section 14, he said. His voice was almost normal. "Almost. You have read the Collective Research Conduct Charter." "I heard it," Dara said. "You left a copy on Goss's tablet during the 3rd feeding cycle of month 2. He set it on the cart within reach of my slot. I had approximately 40 minutes. Goss made a very small sound. Brawl said nothing for 6 seconds, then he turned to the junior staff. "Clear the bay." He looked at Goss. "Get Vane." He looked back at Dara. Something was happening behind his eyes that she did not have a word for in Vethric or English. She had a word for it in the private language of her own head. She had been filing moments under that word for 6 months, saving them for this one. The word was too late. They were sending for Vane. The ship had slowed from its course in all the ways that mattered, procedurally, politically, legally, because Veth collective law, for all its coldness, was precise. And she had used its precision like a tool, because that was what it was. She had 60 hours, maybe more, before the thread either held or broke. 60 hours was a very long time for someone who knew how to wait. The human ship did not announce itself. One moment the ardent silence was running its normal operating routines, and the next moment every proximity alert on the bridge fired at once as a vessel of a class the crew had not expected to see in this sector dropped out of transit speed at approximately 400 kilometers off the port side, running full identification codes and a diplomatic channel request on a frequency that had not been used since the early days of humanity's first deep space contacts. Commander Vane, who had spent 36 hours dismantling Brawl's logs and reviewing camera feeds and arriving at conclusions she did not like, was on the bridge when it happened. The reports said her expression did not change. They also said she put her tablet down very carefully, which was worse. The human vessel's captain was a man named Adisa, broad across the shoulders, unhurried in the way people are when they have made all their decisions before they walked into the room. He opened the channel and said, in serviceable Vethric, that he was here to collect 2 human nationals being held without diplomatic notification, and that he had in his possession a 47-page document written in formal Vethric by a 9-year-old child, and that this document had already been transmitted to 4 separate authorities, and that he would be happy to wait the appropriate amount of time for the ardent silence to process the relevant legal implications of its situation. He waited. The Veth Collective, for all its size and certainty, did not have a clean move. Vane's unauthorized policy disclosure, witnessed and documented by an uncleared specimen who had turned out to be anything but uncleared, had created an internal breach under their own law. Releasing the specimens was the only option that did not make every other option worse. It took 3 hours to process, file, and authorize. It felt to the people waiting much longer. Goss was the one who opened the cell. He stood at the door after it released and looked at Dara, who was already standing with her drawing pad under one arm. She had gathered nothing else because there was nothing else to gather. She had been ready for this since the night she put the tray in the slot. He said in Vethric, quietly, "Why did you never tell me you understood?" She looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad person. She had decided this months ago and never changed her assessment. He was a person who had not asked the right questions, which was a different thing, but not a small one. She said, "Because you never asked, you only watched." He had no answer for that. She had not expected one. She walked past him into the corridor, which felt both exactly as she had mapped it and entirely different when walked through with her own feet. She followed the route she had memorized to the lower deck, and the door she had identified 6 weeks ago opened on the second code she tried, and inside the small secondary holding room, sitting against the far wall with her arms around her knees, was Dr. Willa Osei. Dr. Osei looked up. Her face did several things in very quick succession. Dara crossed the room and sat down next to her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the sitting did not already say better. Dr. Osei put one arm around her and held on, and Dara let herself be held, which was something she had not allowed herself to want for a long time, because wanting things that were not available was a way of spending attention she needed for other things. She allowed herself approximately 40 seconds. Then she said, "We need to go." The transfer to the human vessel happened in a way that was technically correct in every procedural detail and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, which was, Dara supposed, the best possible outcome for everyone. Captain Addison met them at the airlock. He was tall, and he had the expression of a person who had read something unexpected and was still working out how to carry it. He looked at Dara and said, in English, "I read your document." She waited. 47 pages, he said, written in a language you were not taught by a 9-year-old. He paused, in the dark. The last 14 pages were in the dark, she said. The others were in low light. It was fine. Captain Addison looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, as though filing something away. "I have a few questions." "I know," Dara said. "I have answers." Later, after the medical checks, after Dr. Os had been given something to eat and a place to sit that was not a holding room, after the immediate formal documentation had been completed, Captain Addison sat across from Dara at a small table in a room that smelled like recycled air and something faintly familiar, like coffee and metal and home. "The holding station they were heading to," he said. "Do you know where it is?" "I know the route designation," Dara said, "and the travel time from their current position as of 6 days ago. I did not have exact coordinates, but I have enough to narrow it significantly." She paused. "I can draw you a map." He slid a pad across the table. She began to draw. Behind them, through the small viewport, the ardent silence grew smaller as the human ship pulled away. It was still visible when Dara finished her map and slid it back across the table, and she watched it diminish in the glass. A research vessel that had called itself neutral, had called itself scientific, had believed with complete confidence that the small creature in its care was no threat. She watched it until it was gone. On the ardent silence, Overseer Brawl sat at his station and pulled up the specimen file for the last time. He reviewed the logs, the camera feeds, the 6 months of observations. He read his own notes, all the entries that said, "No threat, no cognition, no concern." He deleted nothing. There was no point. The document was already transmitted. The record was already made. He opened a new entry. He sat for a long moment, the cursor waiting. Then he wrote one word. The Vethric word translates, roughly, across the gap between their language and any other, as dangerous. He closed the file. It was the first accurate thing he had written about her. And somewhere on a human ship, pulling through the dark toward answers she had already begun to calculate, Dara set down the drawing pad and looked out at the stars. The same stars she had memorized from the tiny angle of viewport visible through her cell in the early months, when she was still new to the ship and had not yet decided to be something other than afraid. She had made that decision in the 3rd week. Right around the time she learned the word for door.